The hardest lesson anyone will ever teach you is not how to turn the wheel. It is how to believe you deserve to choose your own direction. The examiner handed me my new driver's license with a polite smile, but I barely looked at it. Instead, my eyes searched the parking lot until they found the familiar dark blue pickup truck waiting beneath a row of maple trees glowing with early autumn colors. Ethan Brooks leaned casually against the driver's side door with his hands in the pockets of his jacket, looking exactly as calm as he had during every lesson over the past 8 months. I walked toward him holding the license so tightly that the edges bent slightly in my hand. He smiled before I even reached him. "Congratulations," he said. "You earned it." I laughed quietly. That is not the part one keeps thinking about. He tilted his head. "Then what is?" I looked down at the small plastic card that had once seemed impossible to earn. "The hardest thing you ever taught me was never how to drive." He looked at me for a long moment, his expression softening with the kind of understanding that needed no explanation. Before he could answer, my phone vibrated with a message reminding me that my flight to Seattle was only 2 weeks away. The excitement of a new job mixed with the ache of leaving behind everything familiar. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and looked at Ethan again, wondering how something that had started with a driving lesson had quietly changed the way I saw my entire future. 8 months earlier, I would never have imagined standing here. Back then, simply sitting behind the steering wheel was enough to make my hands shake. It all began on a warm Saturday morning when my older brother Logan tossed a set of car keys onto the kitchen counter while I was pretending to focus on my cereal instead of the unopened email offering me my dream job in Seattle. "You know they expect you to have a driver's license before your first day, right?" he asked with a grin. I sighed. "I know. And your test is in 2 months." "I know." "Then today is the day." I already knew what came next, and I dreaded hearing it. Logan reached for his phone before I could. "Object." I already called Ethan. My spoon froze halfway to my mouth. "You what?" He said yes. "You volunteered him without asking me." Logan laughed. "Actually, I asked him first." He agreed before I even finished explaining. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed both hands across my face. I failed twice already, which is exactly why you need someone patient. Less than an hour later, I stood in front of Logan's house staring at an aging silver sedan parked neatly along the curb. Ethan stepped out carrying 2 paper coffee cups and greeted me with the same relaxed smile I had seen at family barbecues and birthday dinners for years. He handed me 1 cup. "Hot chocolate," he said. "Logan told me coffee makes you nervous." I blinked in surprise. I had mentioned that exactly once years ago. "You remembered?" He shrugged lightly. "Some things are worth remembering." My heartbeat became strangely uneven, and I quickly looked away before he noticed. Ethan walked around to the passenger side, opened the door, then paused and smiled. "Actually," he said, tossing me the car keys with perfect confidence, "today you are driving." I stared at the keys resting in my palm, suddenly wondering whether learning to drive was ever really the lesson waiting for me. The car keys felt heavier than they should have. I stood beside the silver sedan for several seconds, staring at them as though they belonged to someone else. Ethan waited patiently without saying a word. He never rushed me. He never reached for the keys. He simply leaned against the passenger door with an easy smile that somehow made the quiet feel less intimidating. Finally, I unlocked the driver's door and slid behind the steering wheel. The familiar scent of clean upholstery mixed with the faint aroma of Ethan's coffee filled the car. My hands settled on the wheel exactly the way my driving instructor had shown me during my previous lessons, yet my heartbeat still raced. "Seat first," Ethan reminded me gently. I adjusted the seat until my feet reached the pedals comfortably. "Mirrors." I checked each one carefully. "Seat belt." The reassuring click echoed through the quiet car. Ethan fastened his own seat belt before nodding toward the ignition. "There is no hurry." I took a slow breath and started the engine. The sound immediately brought back memories of the minor accident I had experienced during high school, when another student had accidentally backed into the parking space I was trying to leave. Nobody had been hurt, but ever since then I had convinced myself that I simply was not meant to drive. "You are somewhere else," Ethan observed. I looked straight ahead. I always am when I sit behind a steering wheel. He rested one arm comfortably against the window. "Then let us bring you back here." I smiled nervously. "How?" "Tell me 5 things you can see." I blinked. "What?" "Humor me." I looked through the windshield. A stop sign. 2 maple trees. A blue mailbox. Logan's basketball hoop. Your truck. He nodded. 4 things you can feel. I thought for a moment. The steering wheel. My jacket. The seat. My shoes. 3 things you can hear. Birds. The engine. You. His smile widened slightly. Good. Now you are in this car instead of reliving an old memory. I realized my shoulders had relaxed without me noticing. Ethan never told me to stop being afraid. He simply gave my mind somewhere safer to stand. Ready? He asked. I hesitated before shifting the car into drive. The sedan rolled forward less than 3 feet before the engine stalled. I groaned and covered my face with both hands. That was impressive, I muttered sarcastically. Ethan chuckled softly. It happens. Not to people who know what they are doing. Everyone who knows how to drive once stalled a car for the first time. I restarted the engine. 30 seconds later it stalled again. My frustration grew with every attempt. By the 4th stall, I leaned back against the seat and sighed. You should probably find a better student. Ethan looked out through the windshield for a moment before turning toward me. Noah. It was the first time he had said my name that morning. Do you know what I have noticed? I shook my head. Every time the car stalls, you apologize before you even try again. I frowned. Because I keep messing up. No. His voice remained calm. Because somewhere along the way, you started believing mistakes are proof that you should quit. The words landed harder than I expected. They were no longer about driving. They were about every opportunity one had quietly talked myself out of after that small accident years earlier. Ethan pointed toward the empty parking lot ahead. Start the engine one more time. I looked at him uncertainly. What if I stall again? He smiled with complete confidence. Then we will learn something again. I turned the key once more, took a slower breath than before, and gently lifted my foot from the brake. This time the car moved forward smoothly, rolling across the quiet parking lot beneath the bright autumn sun. I could not stop smiling. Ethan did not celebrate or clap. He simply looked ahead and said the same 2 words that would quietly become the foundation of every lesson we shared after that. Again, Noah. The word again became the rhythm of every Saturday morning that followed. Sometimes we met just after sunrise when the streets were almost empty. Other times we practiced in the quiet hours before dinner as the golden evening light stretched across the pavement. Week after week, the silver sedan slowly became less intimidating. My hands no longer trembled every time I reached for the steering wheel, although they still tightened whenever we approached a busy intersection. Ethan never pretended confidence appeared overnight. He treated it like something built 1 small mile at a time. Every lesson began the same way. Adjust the seat. Check the mirrors. Fasten the seatbelt. Take 1 slow breath. Then drive. Before long, those simple routines felt less like instructions and more like quiet reminders that I was capable of handling the road ahead. One crisp October afternoon, Ethan glanced toward me after we pulled out of another empty parking lot. Today we are leaving the neighborhood, he said. I almost pressed the brake again. Already? He nodded calmly. You are ready. I laughed nervously. You have much more faith in me than I do. He looked through the windshield with an easy smile. That is temporary. The residential streets gradually gave way to wider roads lined with small businesses, coffee shops, and grocery stores. Cars passed in both directions, not too fast, not too close, but enough to make my heartbeat speed up again. I noticed my grip tightening on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned pale. Ethan did not tell me to relax. Instead, he pointed toward the road ahead. Where are your eyes? I blinked. On the car in front of us. Look farther. I raised my gaze beyond the nearest vehicle until I could see the traffic light almost a quarter mile away. Somehow the road immediately felt less crowded. Drivers naturally steer toward whatever they stare at, Ethan explained. Do not focus on what you are afraid of hitting. Focus on where you want to go. I quietly repeated the sentence to myself. Where you want to go. The words stayed with me long after we cleared the intersection. We drove through downtown, crossed a small bridge over the river, and eventually stopped at a neighborhood cafe overlooking a public park filled with families enjoying the autumn weather. Ethan bought 2 hot chocolates before sitting across from me at an outdoor table. You remembered again, I said, looking at the cup in my hands. What? That I do not drink coffee. He smiled lightly. You have mentioned it before. I laughed. Once. Years ago. He shrugged as though remembering small details was the most ordinary thing in the world. We spent the next half hour talking about things that had nothing to do with driving. He asked about my design classes. I asked about the bridge project his engineering team had recently completed. We debated our favorite movies, laughed about Logan's terrible attempts at cooking, and discovered we both secretly enjoyed the same old acoustic playlists during long drives. The conversation felt surprisingly easy. For the first time, I stopped thinking of Ethan as only my brother's closest friend. I started seeing the person sitting across from me. On the drive home, the afternoon sun settled low across the horizon, filling the windshield with warm golden light. I merged onto a larger boulevard without stalling, without panicking, and without asking Ethan whether I was doing it correctly. Several quiet minutes passed before he finally spoke. "Did you notice something?" I glanced toward him for only a second before returning my eyes to the road. "What?" He smiled with unmistakable pride. "You have been driving for almost 20 minutes, and you forgot to be afraid." By the middle of November, driving had become less about memorizing rules and more about learning to trust myself. Ethan still arrived every Saturday with the same quiet smile, and I still climbed into the driver's seat with the familiar mixture of determination and uncertainty, but something had changed. The silence between us no longer felt awkward. It felt comfortable, like two people who no longer needed to fill every mile with conversation. We drove through neighborhoods decorated for the approaching holidays, crossed familiar intersections, practiced parking beside quiet sidewalks, and circled shopping centers until parallel parking no longer felt impossible. Ethan celebrated every improvement the same way. He simply nodded once and said, "Again." Somehow that single word always sounded less like a command and more like confidence borrowed until I could build my own. One rainy afternoon, dark clouds rolled across the city just as we finished another lesson. Large drops tapped gently against the windshield while traffic slowed around us. Ethan glanced toward the road ahead before pointing to a quiet overlook beside the river. "Pull over for a minute," he said. I parked carefully, shifted into park, and turned off the engine. Rain continued falling steadily, surrounding the car with a soft rhythm that made the outside world feel wonderfully distant. Neither of us hurried to leave. I rested my hands loosely on the steering wheel while watching tiny streams of water race across the glass. "You know," I said quietly, "I used to think confidence meant never being scared." Ethan looked toward the rain instead of interrupting. "Now I think it just means driving anyway." He smiled. "That is a much better definition." We sat there for several peaceful moments before he reached into the center console and handed me a small package of crackers. "You forgot lunch again," he said. I stared at him in surprise. "How did you know?" He laughed, softly. "Because every lesson that starts after noon ends with you pretending you are not hungry." I opened the package, shaking my head. "You notice everything." "Not everything. Enough to make it a little unfair." He shrugged with an almost embarrassed smile. "Paying attention is part of caring about people." The sentence lingered quietly between us. I looked back out the windshield, suddenly aware that the rain was no longer the loudest thing inside the car. My own heartbeat had taken its place. Trying to lighten the moment, I smiled and asked, "So how many students have you taught?" "Only one." I blinked. "Really? Really? Then why are you so patient?" He thought for a second before answering. "Because I never wanted your fear to become the reason you stopped chasing the life you wanted." I looked down at my hands resting on the steering wheel. "Most people just tell me to get over it. Fear rarely listens to that advice." His voice remained calm and steady. "It usually listens to consistency instead." The rain gradually slowed until only a few drops remained on the windshield. I started the engine again, adjusted the mirrors almost automatically, and prepared to pull back onto the road. Before I shifted into drive, I noticed the playlist already waiting on the dashboard screen. It was the same acoustic album I had casually mentioned liking months earlier during our first stop for hot chocolate. I smiled without thinking. "You remembered my favorite playlist too?" Ethan looked almost surprised that I had noticed. "I figured driving feels easier when the road sounds familiar." I eased the car onto the street, but this time my thoughts stayed with him instead of the traffic. Every favorite song, every cup of hot chocolate, every patient reminder, every small detail he quietly remembered formed a picture I had somehow overlooked for years. As the city lights reflected across the wet pavement ahead, I found myself wondering a question that had nothing to do with driving anymore. Had Ethan always been paying this much attention to me, or had I only just learned how to notice him? The day of my driving test arrived with clear winter skies and air so cold. that every breath disappeared in a cloud before I reached the testing center. I had imagined this morning dozens of times, yet none of those versions captured how strangely calm I felt while sitting in the driver's seat waiting for my name to be called. Ethan stood outside near the sidewalk holding 2 cups of hot chocolate, just as he had on the first day we met for our lesson. He raised one cup with a quiet smile when he noticed me looking through the windshield. No dramatic speech, no last-minute advice, just the same steady confidence that had carried me through every practice session. Before I stepped out of the car, he tapped lightly on the driver's window. I lowered it a few inches. "One question," he said. "Where are you looking today?" I smiled because I already knew the answer. "Where I want to go." He nodded once. Exactly. Those 2 words stayed with me during the entire examination. Every turn, every stop sign, every lane change, every parking maneuver felt less like a test and more like another Saturday lesson. When the examiner finally asked me to park and switch off the engine, I realized my hands were no longer shaking. He finished writing on his clipboard before turning toward me with an encouraging smile. "Congratulations," he said. "You passed." I thanked him, accepted the paperwork, and stepped out into the bright afternoon sunlight feeling lighter than I had in years. Ethan was the first person I looked for. He was waiting exactly where he had been before, leaning casually against his truck with that familiar calm expression. The moment our eyes met, I could not stop smiling. I crossed the parking lot almost without thinking and wrapped him in a quick, grateful hug. It lasted only a second before I stepped back, suddenly realizing what I had done. Ethan looked surprised at first, then quietly smiled. "I am proud of you, Noah." Before I could answer, another familiar voice called my name. I turned and saw Logan walking toward us from the visitor parking area, carrying a paper bag from my favorite sandwich shop. He slowed as he reached us, his eyes moving from my happy expression to Ethan's before settling on the temporary driver's certificate still clutched in my hand. "Looks like I arrived just in time," he said with a grin. "Did I miss the celebration?" I laughed nervously. "Just the first 5 seconds of it." Logan handed me the paper bag. I figured passing deserved lunch. We found a picnic table near the edge of the parking lot overlooking a small public park where children laughed while chasing each other across the winter grass. The conversation drifted naturally from the test to my upcoming move to Seattle. Then my phone vibrated with a new email notification. I opened it absent-mindedly, expecting another onboarding document from my future employer. Instead, the message confirmed that the company wanted me to begin orientation 2 weeks earlier than originally planned. My smile faded slightly. "Everything all right?" Logan asked. I nodded slowly while rereading the message. They moved my start date. Ethan looked at me carefully. "Sooner? 2 weeks sooner." The excitement I had been carrying all afternoon suddenly mixed with something much heavier. I had worked incredibly hard to earn this opportunity. Yet standing there beside the 2 people who had helped me believe in myself, I realized how little time remained before I would have to leave Chicago behind. Ethan stayed quiet for several moments before speaking softly. "Every road eventually asks whether you are ready to keep going." I folded my new driver's certificate and slipped it carefully into my wallet. Looking toward the open highway beyond the parking lot, I quietly wondered whether the next journey I needed to face would be much harder than the one that had finally taught me how to drive. The drive home from the testing center felt different. For the first time, nobody reminded me to check my mirrors or watch my speed because those habits had quietly become my own. Logan followed behind in his SUV while I drove the silver sedan with Ethan sitting beside me, not as an instructor anymore, but simply as someone sharing the road. We hardly spoke during the first few miles. The silence was comfortable, interrupted only by soft acoustic music playing through the speakers and the steady rhythm of tires rolling across the winter pavement. Eventually, Ethan glanced toward me with a small smile. "You are driving differently." I looked ahead at the road stretching toward the horizon. "Better." He nodded. "More confidently." I laughed softly. I finally stopped waiting for someone to tell me every next step. He looked out the passenger window before quietly saying, "That was always the goal." Those words stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. After lunch, Logan suggested we stop by his house before everyone headed home. His living room was decorated for the holidays, with strings of warm lights wrapped around the staircase and the smell of fresh cookies filling the house. Logan disappeared into the kitchen to make coffee while Ethan and I carried a few shopping bags inside. As I set them near the front door, I noticed a framed photograph sitting on the hallway table. It had been taken nearly 4 years earlier during a family barbecue. Logan stood in the center laughing, surrounded by friends. I was in the background talking to one of my cousins. Ethan stood even farther back, but his eyes were not on the camera. They were looking directly at me. I stared at the picture a little longer than I intended. "That one was your brother's favorite," Ethan said quietly after noticing where I was looking. I picked up the frame carefully. "I never noticed this before." He smiled faintly. "Most people only look at themselves in old photographs." Before I could respond, Logan returned carrying 3 mugs. He noticed the picture in my hands and smiled knowingly. "Funny story about that day," he said. "Ethan almost left early because he had another meeting, but I convinced him to stay." Ethan lowered his eyes toward his coffee without saying anything. Logan continued, completely unaware of the effect his words were having on me. "Looking back, I think he always found an excuse to stay whenever you were around." The room suddenly became very quiet. Ethan cleared his throat softly. "Logan." My brother looked between us before raising an eyebrow. "What?" Ethan gave a small, embarrassed smile. "You do not have to tell every story." Logan leaned back against the kitchen counter, studying both of us for several long seconds. Then something shifted in his expression, as though several scattered memories had suddenly connected into one clear picture. He set his mug down slowly. "Wait a minute," he said. His voice remained calm, but there was unmistakable curiosity behind it now. He looked at Ethan first. "How long?" Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward me before speaking with complete honesty. "Long enough that I chose to keep it to myself because I valued your friendship more than my own feelings." Logan nodded thoughtfully instead of reacting with surprise or frustration. Then he turned toward me. "And you?" I took a slow breath. I only realized the truth after spending the last 8 months learning who Ethan really is instead of who I assumed he was. Logan smiled gently, almost as though he had been expecting this conversation for much longer than either of us realized. "You know," he said quietly, "the only reason I asked Ethan to teach you was because I trusted one thing more than anyone else." I looked at him with genuine confusion. "What was that?" He smiled at both of us before answering. "I trusted that he would always put your happiness ahead of his own, even if it meant never telling you how he felt." The conversation stayed with me long after I left Logan's house that evening. Snow had begun falling lightly again, covering the sidewalks with a thin white layer that reflected the streetlights as I drove home alone for the first time without anyone sitting in the passenger seat. The drive should have felt like another milestone, yet my thoughts kept returning to Logan's words. He had trusted Ethan with something far more important than teaching me how to drive. He had trusted him with me. During the next several days, I threw myself into preparing for Seattle. Boxes slowly filled my apartment, paperwork covered the dining table, and every completed task reminded me that my departure was getting closer. The excitement I had felt when I first accepted the job had become mixed with something quieter and far more complicated. Every time I looked at the packed suitcases near the front door, I found myself wondering whether I was leaving at exactly the moment I had finally found the courage to stop running from my feelings. A few evenings later, Ethan called and asked if I wanted one final practice drive before I left. I smiled as soon as I heard his voice. "I already passed the test," I reminded him. "I know," he replied with a laugh. "This one is just for the road." We met just before sunset and drove north along the lakefront while the sky faded from pale blue to deep shades of orange and gold. Without the pressure of lessons or examinations, the drive felt completely different. We rolled down the windows slightly despite the cold air, letting the fresh breeze fill the quiet spaces between our conversations. Eventually, we parked beside Lake Michigan, where gentle waves reflected the last light of the evening. Neither of us hurried to leave the car. Ethan looked out across the water before speaking. "You are going to do well in Seattle." I rested my hands loosely on the steering wheel. "I hope so." He turned toward me with the same calm expression that had encouraged me through every difficult lesson. "Hope has nothing to do with it. I have watched you earn every mile of confidence you have now." I smiled but quickly looked away. Part of me wishes things had happened at a different time. He understood immediately. "Because you are leaving." I nodded. "Because I finally know what I feel." The words hung quietly between us. Ethan took a slow breath before answering. "Then I need to tell you something too." I waited. "I care about you very deeply, Noah." His voice remained steady, warm, and completely sincere. but I am not going to ask you to stay. I looked at him in surprise. Why not? He smiled gently. Because if I asked you to give up the opportunity you worked so hard to earn, I would be putting my happiness ahead of yours. That is not the kind of relationship I want for either of us. I felt my eyes sting unexpectedly. What if leaving changes everything? It will, he answered honestly. Every meaningful journey changes something. He looked toward the road stretching ahead beside the lake. But if what we have discovered is real, then it deserves the chance to grow, without asking either of us to sacrifice the future we have worked to build. I laughed quietly through the emotion gathering in my voice. You always make the difficult answer sound simple. He smiled. No, I just believe love should never become another reason someone is afraid to move forward. We sat together watching the last sunlight disappear beyond the horizon until the city lights slowly came alive around the shoreline. As I started the engine to drive us back, I realized that the greatest lesson Ethan had ever given me was no longer about confidence behind the wheel. It was about choosing the road ahead because it was truly mine, even when it meant trusting that the right person would still be waiting somewhere farther down that road. The morning I left for Seattle arrived with bright winter sunlight spilling across the highway, as though the city itself wanted to give me a clear road forward. Logan hugged me outside my apartment before loading the last suitcase into my car. Ethan stood a few steps away, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, wearing the same calm smile that had greeted me on the very first driving lesson months earlier. None of us tried to pretend the goodbye would be easy. After everything was packed, Ethan reached into his coat pocket and held out a small key attached to a worn leather tag. I recognized it immediately. I thought you were keeping it, I said quietly. He nodded. I was. He placed the key in my hand. But I realized something. I looked down at the tag. The studio? The lease is still yours if you ever decide to come back. I looked at him in surprise. You kept it all this time? He smiled. Not because I expected you to change your mind. Because I wanted you to know you would always have somewhere to begin again. My throat tightened. You really think that far ahead? He laughed softly. Engineers usually do. Logan looked between us before quietly stepping back toward his truck. I think the two of you deserve a few minutes, he said with an understanding smile. As he walked away, the silence that followed felt gentle rather than uncomfortable. I turned the key over in my hand before offering it back to Ethan. Not yet, I said. If I take this today, I will always wonder whether I accepted it because leaving scared me. Ethan closed my fingers around the key again and gently pushed my hand back toward me. Then keep it until you no longer have to wonder. I looked at him with quiet confusion. What if that takes years? Then it takes years. His answer came without hesitation. Good things are not measured by how quickly they happen. I slipped the key into the small storage compartment beside the steering wheel. It was close enough to reach, but no longer something I needed to hold. The drive to Seattle became the longest trip I had ever taken alone. Every few hours, Ethan sent simple messages. Remember to rest. Check the weather before crossing the mountains. Eat something besides gas station snacks. Each message made me smile because none of them asked when I was coming home. He trusted me to finish the journey I had chosen. The months that followed passed faster than I expected. My new job challenged me in the best possible ways. I explored unfamiliar neighborhoods, found a small apartment overlooking the water, and spent weekends sketching parks, cafes, and city streets that slowly became familiar. Every Sunday evening, Ethan and I talked on the phone. Sometimes we discussed work. Sometimes we compared playlists for long drives. Sometimes we simply stayed connected while watching the same sunset from different cities. Seasons changed. Winter became spring, spring became summer, and before I realized it, nearly a year had passed. During that time, I drove thousands of miles without once doubting whether I belonged behind the wheel. More importantly, I stopped doubting whether I deserved the future I had built for myself. One quiet autumn afternoon, while organizing a shelf in my apartment, I found the small leather-tagged key resting exactly where I had left it on the first day in Seattle. I picked it up and smiled. For the first time since leaving Chicago, I no longer saw it as a reminder of something I had left behind. It had become a promise that home was not a place waiting for me to return unchanged. It was the place where the people who truly cared about me would still be waiting whenever I was finally ready to drive back toward them. 1 year later, the familiar Chicago skyline appeared on the horizon just as the late afternoon sun painted the sky with shades of gold and amber. I rested one hand lightly on the steering wheel, smiling to myself as I realized the drive that once would have terrified me had become something I genuinely loved. The road no longer represented fear. It represented every choice that had brought me here. My phone buzzed through the car speakers. Logan's cheerful voice filled the cabin. "You are about 15 minutes away, right?" "Closer to 10, I answered with a smile. "Good. Somebody has been pretending not to watch the traffic app every 5 minutes. I laughed because I already knew who he meant. "Tell him I will be there soon." Logan chuckled. "I think he would rather hear that from you." The call ended, leaving me alone with the quiet music Ethan had introduced me to nearly a year earlier. Some habits had never changed, and I hoped they never would. When I finally pulled into the familiar lakeside parking area beside Lake Michigan, Ethan was already there, leaning against his dark blue pickup truck exactly the way he had stood outside the driving test center months before. He looked up as my car came to a stop, and the smile that crossed his face made the long drive feel shorter than ever. I stepped out, closed the driver's door, and for a brief moment neither of us spoke. There was no awkwardness, only the comfortable certainty that distance had never erased what we had quietly built together. Ethan walked over with the same calm confidence that had always made every difficult situation feel manageable. "Welcome home," he said softly. I looked around at the lake, the trees, and the city that had once seemed impossible to leave behind. Then I looked back at him. "It feels different." He nodded. "Because you are different." I laughed quietly. "I think you are right." We began walking along the shoreline as gentle waves rolled onto the rocks below. Families strolled nearby, cyclists passed on the lakeside trail, and a cool breeze carried the scent of the water through the crisp autumn air. Everything felt wonderfully ordinary, and somehow that made the moment even more meaningful. After a few minutes, I reached into the storage compartment inside my jacket and removed the small brass key attached to the worn leather tag. I placed it carefully into Ethan's hand. He looked down at it before raising his eyes to mine. "You are giving it back?" he asked. I smiled and gently closed his fingers around the key. "No." He looked puzzled. "Then what does this mean?" I took a slow breath before answering. "It means I finally understand why you gave it to me." The breeze lifted a few fallen leaves across the path as we stood facing each other beneath the warm evening light. "A year ago, I thought the key represented a place," I continued. "Now I know it represented trust. You never asked me to choose between my future and my feelings. You believed I could have both." Ethan's expression softened with quiet emotion. "Because I believed you deserved both." I smiled, feeling more certain than ever before. "You taught me how to trust myself before I ever learned how to trust anyone else." He let out a quiet laugh. "I thought I was only teaching you how to drive." I shook my head. Driving was just the excuse that brought us onto the same road. We stood together watching the sun slowly disappear beyond Lake Michigan until the first city lights reflected across the water. Finally, Ethan held out his hand, not to lead me or guide me, but simply to walk beside me. I slipped my hand into his, knowing the choice was entirely my own. Together we returned to the car, and this time I walked confidently to the driver's side. Ethan settled into the passenger seat with the same relaxed smile he had worn during our very first lesson. I started the engine, adjusted the mirrors out of habit, and looked toward the open road stretching ahead beneath the evening sky. Ethan glanced at me and smiled. "Where are you looking today?" I returned the smile without hesitation. "Exactly where I want to go." The car rolled forward smoothly along the shoreline, carrying us toward whatever tomorrow might bring. And for the first time, I understood that the greatest destination was never a city at all. It was becoming the person brave enough to choose both the road and the one who quietly chose to travel it beside me.